So for today's event, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Eric Topol, who, in conversation with Vivienne Parry, will explore how AI will shape the future of healthcare, from medical forecasting technologies to doctor-patient relationships to bridging gaps in health equity. And with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for the day, Vivienne Parry, acclaimed science writer and broadcaster. So, a scientist by training, Vivienne is passionate about communicating science and writes extensively on the subject of human health. She currently hosts medical programs for BBC Radio 4, and she previously presented the BBC's iconic science series, Tomorrow's World. Vivienne has been a columnist for The Times, The Guardian, and The News of the World. Vivienne additionally serves as head of engagement at Genomics England, which delivered the 100,000 Genomes Project, and recently completed her term as a member of the board of UK Research and Innovation, which is responsible for the strategic spend of the UK's £7 billion annual research budget. Vivienne, it's a pleasure to be working with you again today, so over to you, please.
Thank you to all of you for joining us today. And my goodness, you are a huge global audience, and hardly surprising given today's guest. Let me introduce Dr. Eric Topol to you. Now, I could say simply that Eric Topol is a practicing cardiologist and executive vice president of Scripps Research, or I could say that he's lead investigator for NIH's All of Us study, or that he's a best-selling author with titles like The Patient Will See You Now and Deep Medicine. Or I could just tell you that he's the author of over 1,300 peer-reviewed articles. That he's all of these things is astonishing, but emerging from the pandemic, there's something else. For nearly 750,000 people on Twitter, or if you must, X, he's the now trusted guide to new science, which he presents with great clarity and humility. Now, Eric Topol has always been a visionary. His college thesis back in 1975 was on gene therapy, and some 25 years ago, he saw what AI might do for medicine, and it's been a defining element of his career ever since. And unpacking its impact and potential in healthcare, particularly in medical forecasting, is the subject of our forum today. Eric, we're so pleased to have you with us.
Thanks for your kind introduction.
And I guess what unites all the elements of your extraordinary career is your ability to integrate multiple data points and infer what they all mean for the future. And I wonder whether it was that first drew you to the potential of AI all those years ago. And can I just say, at that time, there was no supercomputing or high-speed computing. There were no wearables. There were no iPhones.
Yeah, I think kind of growing up with the data exponential growth, it became more apparent over time that humans weren't going to be able to deal with this, that we needed some new tools. And so when we had the genome, that was, of course, sequenced in 2000 or in the early 2000s. That was one part. But then when we got sensors, and as you mentioned, with broadband and smartphones, it just was a total tsunami of data that it's not possible for us to deal with. So that spurred the marked interest in AI. And obviously, we're making big strides. I mean, just in the last couple of years, this thing has just gone into an acceleration that I don't think anyone could fully envision.
Now, we talk about AI in healthcare very often as if it's something in the future, but of course, it's already here. And there are multiple examples of AI that's in use and has been approved. Can you just give us a couple of examples there?
Well, there was already almost 650, 670 algorithms approved or cleared by FDA. Most of these are imaging AI algorithms, but that just shows you that there's been a lot of, in the deep learning phase, This is prior to where we are now in the transformer generative AI. There was just a huge number of algorithms that showed we could interpret scans with the help of AI far better than we could as clinicians or radiologists. And that includes, of course, pathologists too. So this is really the first phase. But right now, of course, it's going in this, as we'll discuss, this multimodal large language model, if you will, phase, which is just building and just going into I think a change of healthcare that nobody could really predict could happen this quickly, particularly in the medical circles, which are very conservative and reluctant to change.
Now, the examples that you use, particularly in things like imaging, use data from one source, and it's in patients that are already symptomatic. But what I wanted to turn to was medical forecasting, which is the particular focus of today's forum. And can we look at an example of how AI can take multimodal data? And by that, I mean data from many, many different sources, including, of course, the now ubiquitous smartphones, to improve disease detection and prevention, say for something like Alzheimer's disease.
Right. Well, I think what we're talking about with medical forecasting is really an exciting opportunity that we've never really had before. And this is, as you mentioned, Alzheimer's is kind of prototypic, but of course, what I'll just review here could be applied to cancer or cardiovascular diseases, across the board. But just use Alzheimer's as an example. And before I get into it, just to mention that multimodal for large language models is referring to the ability to have inputs of text, video, and speech or audio. What we're talking about with multimodal AI in medicine is all the layers that depict or delineate a human being. So let's look at this Alzheimer's type of forecasting, which I wrote about recently in Science with the references on the bottom right. So first of all, what we need to do is to define the risk of the patient, because what we're really interested in is partitioning the high-risk patient. And we can do that now, but of course, it brings in many different factors, which we're not doing today. Firstly, besides the electronic health record, obviously, serial evaluation of that record with structured and unstructured text. But beyond that, we can look at the lifestyle factors. And these are not just the usual things like sleep and diet and exercise, but they include, specifically drilling down on the nutrition for ultra-processed foods, things like air pollution, all sorts of things that play into the exposure and risk with lifestyle and environmental factors. Then we need to consider the gene propensity or predisposition, and obviously the ApoE4 allele, which about 20% of us are carriers, is important to know about if we're going to find high-risk people. There's also a very useful polygenic risk score based on hundreds of variants, which has been validated multi-ancestry. The gut microbiome plays a much more important role than most people would ever have expected. And so doing a gut microbiome will help us understand a person's risk for neurodegenerative diseases. And you could add inflammatory markers. But the other thing, of course, that's been validated in recent years are these blood tests like p-tau217, which tells us about already the accumulation of the unfolded proteins, misfolded proteins in the brain. And then the retina photo. This is extraordinary work that's been led by Pierce Keene and Moorfield's Eye Institute, whereby you could predict the future of Alzheimer's in people who are completely asymptomatic. And this also applies for Parkinson's disease years before by looking at the retinal photo, seeing things in the retinal photo with machine help that humans couldn't see. So that's defining the high risk. Now, if we go to the next phase, which is monitoring those people. So once these people have been identified, they can be serially assessed more closely. So we can do things like rechecking their retina on a frequent basis, checking inflammation markers. There's a clock that has been defined by organs by Tony Whisk-Carre and his colleagues at Stanford that's recently been validated in the UK Biobank. So you could look at the brain clock. And of course, that is complemented by epigenetic DNA methylation. You look at the changes that are being seen in the electronic health record. And of course, you do serial assays of biomarkers for the brain, like p-tau 217. So now, then we have also the important issue of, a person's at high risk. That's not enough. That's not enough because if they're not going to develop Alzheimer's till they're 95, then you don't really need to worry about this. But we need multimodal AI to give us a more precise timing of when the Alzheimer's would begin to manifest, because most importantly, this process takes at least 2 decades to actually develop. So we have this incredible opportunity to intervene during the course of 2 decades. So we need to know in advance when this process is getting roots, because if a person's at high risk and we're seeing signs that something is going on in the brain and inflammation and all these things that I just discussed, that's the time to intervene. And of course, getting a brain MRI or even repeat MRIs can help that as well. And then finally, as we get to when we know that the person is not just a risk, but there's something that is taking this risk to a higher level of warning, it's time to really go after this aggressively. And that's not just the full court press on lifestyle factors, which of course would be initiated from the get-go, all the things that I previously mentioned. But that's where we could get into anti-inflammatory agents. And we're already seeing there's ongoing trials with GLP-1, which is a potent anti-inflammatory, including in the brain. And it has 3 studies, randomized trials that are small, but nonetheless positive for Parkinson's disease. We've never had a Parkinson's disease modifying capability, and it looks like GLP-1 drugs are emerging for that. Hopefully that we'll see that for Alzheimer's as well in the trials that'll be out in just over a year. But there's also the idea of using the anti-amyloid drugs, which have a risk. One was just recommended for approval by the FDA yesterday. And these drugs are potent, but they do carry a risk of brain microhemorrhages and serious issues of how many times you have to get images and get infusions. This is not a simple drug to administer whatsoever. We'll have better drugs, hopefully in the future, as we start to implement this medical forecasting as a prototypic way that we'll do this for many diseases, major diseases in the years ahead. So that's just an outline of where we can go once we have this capability.
So spectacular potential there for patients. And actually, one of the things I'm picking up from you, I mean, particularly in that work at Moorfields, is that it really developed new hypotheses as well, new research hypotheses. And the other thing is that it's pushing us to perhaps reevaluate drugs that have been ruled out as not producing an effect in people who are symptomatic, but might well produce an effect in those pre-symptomatic.
Yeah, absolutely, Vivienne. The problem is we're already seeing a movement by the Alzheimer's Association here in the US that anybody with the biomarker would go on to these drugs. And that, of course, is really indiscriminate. We need much more precise gauging of risk and, whether and when to intervene. And so this is important. Once we get these, eventually we won't have these very cumbersome, very expensive infusion drugs. Hopefully we'll have ones that are much more ideal, practical, and we have to do better than we're doing right now.
So that's that fine tuning that actually AI can give us. But I was thinking actually, as you were saying at the beginning, about the spectacular advance over the last year or so with these large language models. I mean, as you said, much faster than anyone could have predicted. What next generation AI capabilities are you most excited about for disrupting traditional disease diagnosis, particularly in this area of predictive analytics?
Oh, well, this is, I think one example. It's rich, Vivienne. I think one of the things that most people have not been cued into is the opportunistic medical scan interpretation. So we already know that any type of medical scan, whether it's a CT, chest X-ray, ultrasound, MRI, we can get a reading interpretation, if you will, from AI that is supplemental to the radiologist or clinician. But what we didn't know was that we get so much more. So whether it's a retinal photo, whether it's electrocardiogram, whether it's a chest X-ray, the ability to predict things, the retina will tell us, I already mentioned about neurodegenerative disease, but not just that. It tells us about kidney disease, hepatobiliary disease. It is extraordinary, the risk of heart attacks and stroke from the retina, the control of blood pressure and glucose. The chest X-ray tells us about a patient has diabetes. Who would have thought that, from being able to zoom in on the mediastinal fat pads? There's so much in those pixels that we as humans can't pick up. And so to tap into that, we're leaving so much information on the table with the scans that we do. And you could get a calcium score for the heart from a chest X-ray, and that's one of the most frequent tests that are done. Electrocardiogram, you can tell about anemia from the electrocardiogram, no less the risk of developing atrial fibrillation in the future, which is, of course, a leading cause of stroke. And I'm just giving you a little, sense about what is sitting there that we're not taking advantage of right now, because, as mentioned earlier, there's a lot of reluctance to let AI come into the sphere of medical practice.
Okay, so now let's move on, because we need to find a way to move from the dream to the reality. So let's talk a bit about the challenges of multimodal AI in medicine. Now, the next graphic that we're going to show is from a paper that you co-authored, which shows an overview of a multimodal generalist medical artificial intelligence model pipeline. And it's a very complex pipeline that builds the foundation for numerous applications across clinical disciplines, each one requiring careful validation and, of course, regulatory assessment. So can you just talk us through this model and perhaps highlight the challenges in gathering robust evidence of AI's effectiveness in clinical settings? And how do you think that researchers and clinicians and developers, and I know we've got lots of those in our audience today, how can they bridge that gap?
Right. Well, it's similar to what we were talking about with the Alzheimer's, of the multimodal story. So you're taking in, if you start at the left top, the text, audio, and images. Then you also, of course, are bringing in sensors now, if they're appropriate, the genomics. And what's different here is that the entire corpus of the medical literature, which, when we saw ChatGPT and GPT-4 release, they were initially at least a year behind, but now they're keeping up pretty darn well. You could do a prompt now and get citations from earlier that day, and no less. The ability to bring in the medical literature, all publications, and that will continue to get better in terms of being able to rank the quality of those citations, but integrating all these different routes of information so that, for example, as we presented on the lower part, augmented procedures, let's say a surgeon is doing an operation, and we just had a review in Nature Medicine on the remarkable potential of AI in surgery, which a lot of people have not acknowledged so far. But during the operation, not only would that video be processed with a large language model, but also the entire literature, guidance, whether the likelihood of a biopsy is necessary, if there's a potential for cancer, all sorts of things could happen in real time. So when you have all this information and it's all flowing like this, and it's going back to the clinician, we'll talk about to the patient shortly, but it's just an extraordinary difference from what we have now, because now it's basically up to the memory of the clinician. Oftentimes it's extremely difficult to keep up with the medical literature, and it's virtually impossible to integrate all these different layers, types of data in an approach to any individual patient. And that means, going through all of their records, all of their labs, and looking at all their sensor data. We don't have the ability to do that, but machines can be trained to be really good at that.
It is, though, there is that big gap, and there's a big gap on it as well when we'll get to talk about diffusion. But I was wondering how longitudinal data play such an important part in the validation of AI, because it's not enough to do the pre-work, you have to do the follow-up too.
Right. Well, there's many parts to that. So long data, we talk a lot about deep data, big data, but long data is invaluable. And, for example, pancreatic cancer is a very difficult thing to diagnose in the early stages. And unfortunately, when it's usually diagnosed in stage 3 or 4, it has 90% fatality. But we've now seen from multiple sources, but particularly from Denmark and the VA here, that if you had long data and electronic records of the clinical symptoms that occur from time to time, labs, even in the normal range, the trends, you can pick up the pancreatic cancer years in advance, which we're not doing yet, and we should be doing. But long data, is part of this story, because especially the unstructured text, it's rich. Now with large language models, we have the ability to bring that in as inputs. So this is really, I think, a whole different phase of bringing so many different sources of data to synthesize, crystallizing that data at any point in time. But it isn't just a one snapshot. That's, of course, why sensors are so extraordinary, because they provide continuous or high frequency sampling. But in a way, we're trying to do that with serial visits from the electronic health record of everything that's in that record, not just the one note.
We often talk about AI healthcare as being something that will save costs and improve efficiency and outcomes. And I think the WHO thought that there would be at least 18 million healthcare workforce short by 2030. So there's a huge need. But actually, might the computational costs and the technology integration actually drive expenses up? And how should we approach the time scale of cost effectiveness? Because it can be over a long time, and we don't realize the benefits, and often we're in a short-term termist environment.
Right. Well, when we gathered for the NHS review back in 2018, 2019, they had the privilege of working with a big team there to try to see where we could take AI to reduce healthcare costs and reduce the relentless expansion of the healthcare workforce, which is a global problem. The top of the list for transformation was remote monitoring. That is gutting hospitals as we know them today, which eventually will be possible. And we're not going after it like we should right now. But if you look at any health system costs in any place in the world, it's the hospitals that are driving it. Here in the US, with 4.5 trillion plus per year, more than a third is attributable to the hospital. we don't need hospitals for regular people, not in the critical care units or operating rooms or emergency rooms. The rest of those people could be at home with some sensors and an algorithm that's validated, and being able to predict any difficulty, that is, any potential for them to be needing a hospital, a critical care coverage. So we're not doing that. We should be doing that because if we want to gut cost, that's like top of the list. But what we're talking about, Vivienne, is software. It doesn't have to be expensive. But of course, that's a different matter with the companies that we have to deal with, right? So, hopefully we can take advantage of the fact that this is not, once you have these large language models, these base models like Gemini and GPT-4 and what will be 5 shortly, and many others, the Anthropic, then on cloud, you will then, or cloud that is, you will then have the basis for building on those, the Llama 3 of Meta. And so if you piggyback on these, the expense is markedly reduced because these companies have vested in tens of thousands, if not more, graphic processing units. They've borne the cost of building these models. And that, I think, is really something to keep in mind, that that investment they've made.
I want to return in a minute to the involvement of some of the few companies, but I want to just stick on something you just said. Now, the report that you did for the NHS was actually sponsored by Health Education England, which is its main occupation is educating the workforce. And I wonder what new skills, particularly in AI literacy, you thought doctors or other healthcare professionals might need to develop to work alongside AI technologies.
Right. Well, the UK, as you mentioned, Vivienne, has been big in commitment to education, unlike many other countries, including the US. And as a leader, the world leader in genomics, the next thing is to get the clinician workforce up on AI, which is, I think, a work in progress. But the problem is everyone who's involved in healthcare does need to understand AI to some degree, because it's going to be part of our daily lives. I mean, it already is outside of healthcare to some degree, but it's going to have such a huge impact. So understanding some of the nuances, when to trust it, when to question it, the embedded biases, the issues like privacy and driving up inequities, all these things have to be kept in mind. So yes, it needs education, it needs dedicated efforts, which is something we're not doing yet here in the US at all.
Now, let me move on to something which is a particular concern, which is bridging health equity gaps. Because one of the things that's really well understood about AI is that it's only good as the data that it's trained on. And we know that where certain groups are underrepresented in the training data, it can then exacerbate inequities, not only just in the AI model, but in healthcare systems more broadly. So how do we develop systems that avoid or account for those biases?
Right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but just let me say, it has to be deliberate. The biases embedded in our culture are mirrored in our AI. It is not the AI per se, it's just that it's so deeply embedded. And so they have to be interrogated before any model is built and tested and validated. That's one thing. But the other is there has to be intent using AI to reduce inequities. So let me give you some examples. The UK used a mental health chatbot, and they put it out for the whole country. And interestingly, the underrepresented minorities were those who took most advantage of it. And they made it so that this, in many ways, was a deliberate effort. That paper was published in Nature Medicine earlier this year, and it's emblematic of what you can do when you have software that's provided freely and you can help all people, but especially those who need it the most, which is the problem with health inequities. Usually the people that need or access the most are the least likely to get it. Now, another great example that I like is the smartphone ultrasound. So here in the hinterlands of the world, in Africa, in South America, India, places that you would never expect, you have people who have a smartphone and an ultrasound probe that can image any part of the body except the brain with the help of AI, without even knowing what the image should look like. Just put it on the body and the AI could say, turn the probe clockwise or turn it counterclockwise, up or down, and you can get an image of the heart or the lungs or whatever. So this is now opening up technology, not just the acquisition, but the interpretation. And so, you know, pneumonia is being diagnosed with non-clinicians by images in places you would never have expected through AI. I think the idea that you can have a cheap ultrasound probe connected to your smartphone is something a lot of people have not realized is an exceptional opportunity for reducing inequities. We need to see many more examples like this.
It does seem, when you talk about something like that, it's almost like magic. And we talk about democratizing healthcare in that sense. But we also talked about democratizing knowledge with the internet and social media. And, you know, there have been one or two downsides. And part of the introduction and the uptake of AI is about public trust. And we know, I mean, you mentioned it yourself, that a lot of this technology is in the hands of a very few large corporations. A lot of patients see this as a kind of cost-cutting measure that it's taken up by the insurers to cut their insurance costs, you know, all of those kind of things. How do we ensure public trust? Because it's absolutely critical.
Right. Well, trust is, if we're going to do anything for healthcare, we've got to bring that up to the highest level. And, you know, there are lots of reasonable concerns and skepticism, because we know large language models have a tendency to hallucinate or confabulate, to make serious mistakes. So the trust here is only going to be engendered when there's the human in the loop. That is, we're never going to rely only on the AI, but we want, you know, the complementary or synergic capability to be taken advantage of. But really Jeffrey Hinton, who's the godfather of AI referred to, I recently interviewed him, and, you know, I think extremely highly of him because he's appropriately very concerned about AI in general. He's not a doomsdayer, but he's definitely concerned because it's so powerful and it's just going to get even more powerful. But he even partitions medical AI as the sweet spot of AI, where very little in the way of downsides relative to the upside. So I think we have more comfort here that we're not talking about some of the worst scenarios of AI in general, because the healthcare, we're in a very, I wouldn't say desperate situation, but we need a rescue to deal with all this data. And
we need a rescue, and not only from the data, but just the overwhelming burden of healthcare that there is at the moment. A good question here. Sorry, I'm not taking as many of your questions as I'd like, because we've got so much to get in.
Interject,
but let me just quick.
If I could. We shouldn't trust things the way they are today. In the US, there's over 20 million serious medical diagnostic errors a year. Okay, we have 800,000 people approximately either disabled or dead from these. So we have to be more accurate. The more accurate you are, the more trust.
Yeah, and the more, sometimes a bit skeptical about doctor always knows best. Great question here from Carmen Salinas Goodyear. Can AI reduce health inequalities in low middle income countries, or could it actually increase due to gaps in access to technology budgets or available for technology and innovation and other access barriers? A very quick response to that, if you would.
It absolutely could exacerbate inequities around the world, particularly in low and middle income countries. That's why we have to go after this deliberately, as I mentioned, and not let that happen. It should be used the other way, but that's going to take conscious effort.
Now, I think we've got a snapshot here on a slide of data modalities and opportunities for multimodal biomedical AI in augmenting patient experience. How can transparency and patient education be improved to improve, to alleviate fears and misconceptions about AI?
Well, this is just another graph that basically brings in on the left side all those data sources for any given person. And on the right side, the things that can be done with it, like, as I mentioned, hospital at home. And the virtual coach is something that's really exciting, Vivienne, because when you have a person's data, they have all this data, they should have it, they should be owning it, in fact. But when they have it, that can be used to be integrated process by generative AI. And it could tell them they're at risk for a condition and give them feedback, give them the quality, up-to-date medical literature, and basically making recommendations to them about how they can prevent a condition from ever occurring. So this, I think, is one of the longer term prospects. But right now, of course, you can, if you are diabetic and you have a continuous glucose sensor, there is that capability. If you're depressed, there are, or have obesity or high blood pressure, there are virtual coaches for specific conditions. But what we're talking about is something much bigger than that, holistically, with all one's data to prevent conditions that a person is at high risk of manifesting. So that's where we're headed in the years ahead.
I'm being nagged, even as we speak, by my watch to stand up.
Right. That's elemental.
Yes,
That's
I just think, stop nagging me. Stop nagging
It's
me.
going to get much smarter than that. Maybe someday, maybe Apple Intelligence will actually do something. They haven't done anything yet with AI that's meaningful.
Yes, I know that if I nag her 4 times, she's going to go mad and take me off. So let's move on now to the doctor-patient relationship and what AI might do for that, because you've really, it's an absolute, if I had to say anything about Eric Topol and what he believes, it's that AI will humanize the relationship between doctor and patient. But that's really at an opposite end of the spectrum to many of the public who believe that somehow it's a question of, an AI or a human being, or, there's a lot of misconceptions about what that means for doctors and nurses and for their patients. So can you explain your own vision of how AI should be used to benefit the doctor-patient relationship?
Well, this is my favorite topic, as you
I know
alluded to, and it's when I wrote the book Deep Medicine a few years back. And the reason is counterintuitive. How could technology make medicine more humane? And the answer is, of course, by getting rid of all the data clerk function, by giving patients, as we just discussed, more autonomy, more charge, by pulling all the data together of a patient to save what could be hours of reviewing the literature, reviewing the patient's charts, synthesizing things, and on, all these things that AI can do. The point being is that we need, when patients come together with clinicians, we need there to be the real deal connection, presence, trust, the sense that, this doctor has my back, kind of thing, rather than getting roughed up because there's only a few minutes to talk and you never even get the words out because the doctor interrupts the patient in about 8 seconds, never being able to express their concerns. Now, what's really fascinating here is that I never would have predicted this when I wrote the book, is that AI can coach doctors to be better, more empathic, more compassionate and sensitive. So when these synthetic notes, which we will probably talk about here, but when you have a note that's automated from your conversation with the patient, it will then say to the doctor, why did you interrupt Mrs. Jones? Why did you not let her tell you about what she was really concerned about? And basically coach the doctor to be better. And this is something that's exciting because it's getting validated every day now. And we're going to be better trained by AI to be more empathetic. And obviously that relationship is fundamental. When you have a real relationship, an intimate, trust relationship, that's what it's all about. That is the essence of medicine. And we've lost it. We've lost it over the decades. And most people, I think, as everyone's a patient at some point, they can recognize that it's different now than it used to be a few decades ago.
I actually want to quote you something that you wrote in your Ground Truth blog. And here I am going to do a little advert for his Ground Truth blog because it's really, really good. And if you want Eric on his Twitter feed, it's at Eric Topol. But you were highlighting the work of Hippocratic AI, which has published a preprint on what they call Polaris, which is the first safety-focused large language model constellation for real-time patient AI healthcare conversations. And it was rated by nurses and doctors as good or better for each of the 5 parameters assessed: bedside manner, medical safety, clinical readiness, conversation quality, and patient education. So you see something like that, you see patients being enthusiastic. Why are doctors so reluctant still?
Well, they're threatened. I mean, the whole idea is that, this has been a profession that it's always the doctor knows best and been in charge. And the reluctance to kind of give way to be supported. And the data that was presented on this, this is that Hippocratic AI effort that you mentioned, Vivienne, was pretty amazing. They had 1,100 nurses and a couple hundred doctors, and they built a very special, different large language model with many different agents or domains that were specifically assigned to medications, to privacy and security, to different matters. And what they were able to do with these patient actors in hundreds of examples is to have 20-minute conversations, fluid, that were with the AI and the patient actor that were just extraordinary. So this is a segue to, for example, as they showed a post-op patient to get the information they need without having to talk to an actual nurse or doctor, but as a backup. And so we're going to see more of this in the future. But what I liked about this particular one is the #1 goal was safety. And that's what we have to obviously be.
And that brings me on to our last topic of the day. And I want to show you a graph, if I may, which is about the regulation and the proliferation of policy on AI in the recent past, which reflects policymakers really growing awareness of the need to regulate AI and improve their respective countries' abilities to capitalize on its transformative potential. But there's the AI Act in the European Union. President Biden signed an executive order. So we see that there's now a lot of interest. They're rather behind the curve, I think, but there is now a lot of interest. And perhaps that's provoked as much by some of the damage that people are seeing from social media, and they're thinking that they need to be ahead of the curve. So how do you think that regulators can ensure the safety and efficacy of multimodal AI without stifling innovation?
Right. Well, this is really important because what you were showing, of course, wasn't the healthcare world, but the bigger picture. In the healthcare world, there isn't one multimodal AI that's been cleared or approved by the US FDA. But there are, as I mentioned earlier, hundreds of unimodal deep learning AI that has been gotten through the FDA. And what's really saddening is that these are, for the most part, very shaky data sets. We've never seen them. They've not been published, most of them. They're retrospective, they're small, they're overfitted. And this is what gets to be approved or cleared. And that's not acceptable,
And
especially.
it also undermines trust, doesn't it? It also undermines trust.
Absolutely, because not only the doctors can't see the data, but then of course, what about the patients? So we have a bad precedent in the US for giving very quick approvals based on limited retrospective data. And as you know, it's the prospective studies, whether or not they're randomized, in the real world of medicine, where you have to prove that it is working, that it's safe, that it's enhancing the care of patients. And for the most part, there are some exceptions. We just had a review of the 80 plus, almost 90 randomized trials. That's good, but they're few and far between versus the claims that are out there and the FDA's, giving the go ahead. The other thing just to mention is, even when there's good ones that have gone through FDA scrutiny with great data sets, you still have to be careful post-implementation because there can be degradation of performance. So
yeah, you need that long-term data, don't you?
Yeah,
we've got a great question from William Cawthorne here. The AI models often rely on open data for training validation. Is there an ethical obligation for AI-based software to be made open source if it's been trained on public or open data? And if all my audience were not online, I would be asking you to put up your hands, and I suspect a lot of people would be putting up their hands and saying, yeah, that should be it.
Yeah, I would like to see everything open source. I mean, the problem we have is that these frontier models by the oligopoly of tech world are not open source, except for the only exception in the US is Meta's, and it's only, to some extent open source. So we have a problem. We basically have to build around that. It's a hyper dominant situation because here in academics, and also it applies to startup companies, we don't have the resources. We're lucky to have 100 GPUs, not 25,000 or 50,000 or whatever. So this is a problem whereby it's not a level playing field by any means, and it's very much concentrated in a very limited number of very influential tech titans.
Of course, who can pay their staff squillions, and so those really talented people are not available in the regulators and hospitals to oversee things, which is a concern. But how about, we saw there that the EU were making a big strides, the US, but there's a lot of countries that are not doing anything at the moment and probably waiting for others. But AI has no borders.
Right.
How can international collaboration be strengthened so that we have unified standards across the globe, as well as best practices for regulating multimodal AI in healthcare?
Well, you're right. Not enough is being done, especially in the thing that would help us the most as a species, which is promote our health. And so there are a limited number of countries who have made this a big priority and put in resources to do it. China is another one that is dedicated as well, beyond what you mentioned, Vivienne. But this is bigger than what you said, because if we were to build a digital twin infrastructure for all of us, or, a billion of us, let's say, with all the data, and of course, using the privacy computing tools that have emerged that are quite extraordinary, we could use this instead of, or in addition to randomized trials, to help with precision medicine. That is, let's say someone had a diagnosis of cancer and you didn't know what treatment and what outcomes to expect. If you could tap into that resource and find the nearest neighbors, the facsimiles to that patient by every layer of data, you would be able to predict things like we've never seen before. So why aren't we doing that sort of thing? Why aren't countries working together to build digital twin infrastructure? Because it's in all of our interests. There's no reason not to do something like that. As Kai-Fu Lee and I wrote about, It Takes a Planet in Nature Biotech a few years back. So I hope someday we'll get there, but there's unfortunate, this, nationalism or not paying attention to this matter, which is getting in the way.
So you think that there may be regulatory fragmentation in the future because countries will want to do their own thing, but what does that imply for the future?
Well, Europe has done a much better job in terms of, raising the bar requirements than the US for privacy, for security, for the approvals or clearances of a lot of these shaky models. So, hopefully, Europe is setting a better example. I hope that we'll see that following suit. But, we have to keep remembering overall AI is different than healthcare AI. It's almost like two different orbits here. And this requires very specific attention, because if we unleash a really bad model or one that looked good and then it degraded quickly when it was implemented, we could hurt a lot of people really quickly. That's the last thing we want to do.
It's a very quick answer here, but in terms of regulation, should we be allowing AI to mark its own homework?
To market its
own homework. In other words,
I see.
AI
Yes,
to regulate AI.
Yes, grading. Yeah. No. This is why oversight is so important. And yeah, absolutely. We have to be tougher. We have to show teeth in this, and we're not doing that. So, I think that there are some things, by the way, Vivienne, we haven't talked about that don't require regulatory oversight, like the synthetic notes that are doing much more than making a note. That doesn't.
Yeah, those are fabulous, aren't they? Really, really fabulous things.
I think this is the biggest near-term extraordinary development, which is you have a conversation that you normally do with no keyboard, no screen, you actually face-to-face. That note, which includes articulating the physical exam, is derived from the conversation. It's far better than any notes that we have today that are cut and pasted from prior.
But I'm going to interrupt you because Aladdin Banani, who's one of our, and I probably mangled your name, I'm so sorry, is on the call today, and she's saying healthcare is highly business orientated. How can we prevent AI from allowing doctors to see more patients, meaning less time per patient, rather than allowing doctors to spend more time per patient to build real trust? And that is a potential danger, isn't it?
Yeah, so just to finish, once you have that note, you then, without any interaction, data clerk role, you then have all these other downstream functions that are done through the note, through that digitization. That includes follow-up appointments and labs and procedures, nudging the patient for things that were discussed during the visit. The patient has the note and audio so they can clear up confusion. It's at their educational level, things they might have forgotten during the discussion. It's a different world. Now, that saves 2 to 3 hours on average for every clinician using this. Now, the question that is fundamental is, if you're so much more efficient now, then why aren't the overlords that we work for, they're going to say, oh, well, you should see more patients. And that is a very big liability, or read more scans or read more slides. And we have to stand up to that. And that's why, I wrote a New Yorker piece about this, which is we have gravitas working together. We need to stand up for patients. We haven't done that. We have our head in the sand. We just say, oh, well, we're just how to take care of our patients. But what we really need to do is stand up for patients and not let that happen. What we should be doing is having more time with patients. And the gift of time from AI is just one part of this. We have to protect the business people, the overlords, from doing just what is the big threat right now, which is, oh, you're more efficient, wonderful. And we'll have you see 6 patients every hour or 8 patients every. This is not acceptable. It has to get, we have to defend that from happening.
Okay, so we've I can't believe this, but we've got to the end of our time already. How did that happen, Eric? It always happens when I talk to you. Time just runs by so quickly. So can I just take you back to the very beginning of our conversation? So there was Eric Topol 25 years ago talking about AI in the future. And I'm guilty here because in the BBC, we always say, you know, all these marvelous things will happen in 3 to 5 years. That's a standard BBC timeframe. But I wanted to ask you, based on the current trajectory of research, which is just racing ahead, how do you imagine a fully realized system of personalized AI-based medical forecasting in 2040?
Oh, I think by then, I hope. I mean, medicine moves slow. It's a sclerotic, ossified type of community, but I hope by then we'll be well into this, because we need to know at an early time in life what a person is really at risk for and squash that from ever happening. And we can do this. We can do it now. We have so many ways to do this. The Alzheimer's is an example. We couldn't have done the Alzheimer's a few years ago because we didn't have great biomarkers and all these, ways to intervene. So it's happening now. It'll take longer than it should, but by 2040, if we're not doing this across all the major diseases, forecasting for a person when they're, young, in their 20s, so they don't get those conditions when they're in their 60s. We can really do wonders for age-related diseases, which are obviously what does us in and what makes us disabled. Let's hope we do that, and it's routine, and we don't resist, but rather embrace the help from AI.
So it's not a question of if we do it, we absolutely have to do it, because we cannot go on as we are in healthcare and give everybody across the globe the kind of healthcare they deserve without the help of AI. I'm going to pass now back to Fred Fenter. Eric, it's always such a treat. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivienne, and warmest thanks to you, Eric, for these compelling insights into the future of healthcare and the contribution of AI to human health. And also, I'd like to thank everybody who was able to attend today. I hope you enjoyed the session. Please take care and see you next time.